Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over how to fetch data from an API and then store it using SwiftData. We're also going to talk about the various DAO, DTO, and DO objects that you may or may not have heard about yet. And we'll also talk about the trade-offs of what could happen when you do this and when you use this in your production code. If you're ready to learn more about SwiftData, stay tuned. Now, before we jump into an Xcode project, I wanted to kind of go over the object that we're going to be using today, and that will be the JSON placeholder.typeofcode.com/photos. This is an API that we've used several times in the past, and it allows us to get a great fake API response on the internet for free. So again, please go support these guys. But before we get started jumping into Xcode, we wanted to kind of go over our object and see what we've got. So as you can see here, we've got an album, which is an integer, and we've got an ID, which is an integer, and it looks like the ID is an auto-incrementing ID, which just means it adds one each time that we have a new object here. We also have a title, a URL, and a thumbnail URL. So all of these look like strings, and so each of these make up what we will call a photo object. So let's go ahead and jump into Xcode, and then we will start creating our photo object. So here we are in Xcode, and we will right-click on our project and press Command+N to create a new Swift file. And that new Swift file we are going to call our photo DTO. And we'll go over the DTO in more detail here in just a second. So let's go ahead and let's say that we have a struct, and this struct is called photo DTO, and we want it to conform to identifiable and codable, since we will be pulling this down from the internet. And this struct, as we just saw, has an ID, which is an integer. It has an album ID, which is also an integer. It has a title, which is a string. It has a URL, which is also a string. And then it has a thumbnail URL, which is again a string. All right, and the next file that we want to go ahead and create is we will go ahead and create another new file. And this file we are going to call our photo DO. And like I said, we'll go over what those are here in just a second. But this is going to be our SwiftData object. So this is going to be the object that we're going to store in the database. So let's go ahead and import SwiftData, since we know that we already want to store this here. And this will be a class. And this class, again, we'll call photoDO. And we will go ahead and give this class a few properties. So we want our var ID to be an integer, and we want our var album title, or album ID, that was right, to be an integer. And then we want our var title to be a string, a var of URL, which is also a string, and a var with our thumbnail URL, which is again a string. Now, as we can see here, it says class photo DTO has no initializers, so we will go ahead and we will let Swift fix that for us. But we won't use this automatic fix here. Swift is really pretty good about having the ability to just figure it out whenever we start typing init. So we'll come down here and we'll use this autocomplete method here. And as you can see, that got our error fixed for us. So what that did was that just set up our class with the initializer for all the values that are just all required, and they are assigning the properties that we've defined up here as the values that we're passing in our initializer. Now there's one other initializer that I would like to go ahead and create while we're here, and that will be a convenience init. So we will go ahead and create a convenience initializer, and we will pass an item, and that particular item will be our photo DTO. And then we will open our brackets here, and we will say self.init, and we will pass the item.id, the item.album ID, the item.title, the item.url, and the item.thumbnail URL. Let's go ahead and let's make this a little bit easier to read for our future selves. We'll highlight that and press Ctrl+M to put it on each item on multiple lines. There we go. Now let's go ahead and quickly go over the difference between our DO object here and our DTO object here. And there's one more that's really common in the industry that you'll probably hear, which is a DAO. So let's go ahead and go over those. All right, as we can see here, a DTO is a simple object whose primary purpose is to carry data between different layers or processes of an application. And so what that means is whenever we pass our photo DTO around, that is the thing that's going to be passed back and forth around our application. And this DTO is what is going to be passed in to the DO to create a domain object from our DTO. So the domain object, or sometimes called a business object or entity, represents an object from your application's domain or business logic, and encapsulates both data and behavior related to a specific real-world concept. So again, what does that mean? That is anything that you would use to store a value in the database. So this represents essentially an object in our database. In fact, another word that we commonly use around the workplace that I work at is called, can sometimes be referred to as like a database object. Now, a DAO is a design pattern that provides an abstract interface to a database or other persistence mechanism. It encapsulates all of the logic required to perform CRUD, which means create, read, update, and delete operations on data. Now, in SwiftData, we don't ever really use a DAO. As you'll see in just a moment, the model context really performs the options of what our DAO object would do. Since we created our domain object with an implementation that accepts a DTO object, whenever we create, for example, a new object, it simply takes this DTO, creates a DO object from that, and then it stores it to the database without us having to do anything to the object itself. So let's jump back over to our app. And now the last step that we need to do to actually make this photo DO actually be an object in our SwiftData database is to add the @model annotation to this object. And this is what tells SwiftData that this photo DO will be a table in our database. So now let's go back to our main app entry point here. And again, we will import SwiftData. And if you've seen the Getting Started with SwiftData video, you know that we need to pass this data object into the app so that everything in the app knows how to access it. So we will slide down here and choose the one that is a model container for. And we will say that this is our photo do.self. There we are. And now this gives our app access to the photo do through the model container. Now there's one more step that we haven't done yet that we need to go ahead and create, and that is to create one more new file. And in this new file, we will call this new file network service. And then we will say that this is a class called network service. So in this network service class, we will create a function, and this function we'll call update data in database. And it will take the model context that we will pass into it, and that will be of type model context. And this will be an async method. And now we need to go ahead and import SwiftData here. So let's go ahead and import SwiftData. And then we want to make another function really quickly. So let's create another method here in our network service. And let's call this func fetch. And so what this fetch does is it takes any kind of decodable data and we'll pass it in our URL, and it is an async throws that returns whatever type of data that we've told the method that it's going to get. And so we will have a URL, and this guarantees that the URL is in fact a real URL. And then we will try to get the contents out of that URL and decode it, and then return it as the array of the decoded data here. So now, whenever we have our photos object, so let's say let photos object is going to be an array of our photo DTO, and we will say that we want to try and await, and we want to fetch from our JSON placeholder.typeofcode.photos. So we'll go ahead and enforce and wrap that error, since again this tutorial isn't really about networking, it's more about storing the data. So let's go ahead and do that. And so now here we will say that we want for each item in our photos object, we want to create our item to store, and we want that item to store to be a photo DO that takes our DTO object, and so in here we will pass in each item, and then we will just let our model context know that we need to insert the item to store. And so what that will do is this will fetch all of the this will fetch an array of our photo objects, and then we'll go over each of those photo objects, turn them into our DO objects, which is again the model that we are using as our SwiftData model, and then we're going to store those into the database. Now there's one downside to this when dealing with sendable in Swift 6, and that is that we need to make this method a main actor, because this model context still needs to know that it's running on the main actor. All right, and with that we are ready to start using this in our view. So let's jump back over here to our content view, and inside our content view let's go ahead and get rid of the boilerplate code that we've got here, and let's do something. Let's add a couple of variables really quickly. So let's say we want an environment variable, and the environment variable that we want is our model context, and we will call that our var model context. And now it's not going to know what model context is, so let's go ahead and import SwiftData. There we are. And then we want to add a query. So let's go ahead and let's say that we want to sort our photo DO objects by their ID, and then we will call these objects photos, and again they will be an array of our photo DO object. So now that we've got those parameters out of the way, let's go ahead and let's create a list based on all those photos, and then we will take this and say that we have our photo item, and we'll pass that into the list, and inside of here we will create an h-stack, and this h-stack will take our item.id, and since that is an integer we will tell it that we want to format it as a number, and then we will do a spacer, and then we're going to do something a little different here. We're going to do an async image, and that async image takes a URL. So we are going to create a URL from a string, and the string will be our item.url. And we want to force unwrap that here. Again, this is just a demo project. Don't do that in your real projects. And we will take that image that we get back, or possible image that we get back, and we will iterate over each of the cases. So let's switch on our image. And now there are a few cases here, so let's go ahead and fix this. So if it's empty, we want to create an image that has a system name of ellipses. And what that'll do is the empty state is similar to our loading state. So let's go ahead and take care of our success state. So if it works, then we just want to take our image and we want it to be resizable and we want it to be scaled to fit. Now, if there was an error, we want to create an image with a system name of xmark.circle, and we want the foreground style to be .red, and that'll let us be able to see very quickly and easily that something didn't work. And now let's go ahead and, as Swift is telling us, we will handle the default case in case something else happens. So let's go ahead, and in that scenario, we will say that we want an image with a system name of question mark dot folder. Now that'll give us a really good indicator that, hey, something happened and we don't know what it was because it was an unknown error and we just went into our default case here. And now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and go to back to outside of our list, and let's create an overlay to let us know when our list is fetching. So if our photos array is empty, then let's display a progress view. There we go. And now we'll create a task modifier, and this task modifier will go ahead and fetch our photo objects from the network if they're empty. So let's say if, again, our photos dot is empty, then we want to await our network service dot update data, and we will pass in our model context, and then we will allow it to have the pull to refresh option by adding the refreshable modifier. And again, we will just await our network service dot update data, and again we'll pass in our model context there. Now, as you can see, we've just got a progress spinner and nothing is going on in our preview, and that's because our preview doesn't know how to deal with SwiftData. So let's go ahead and fix our preview window here. So inside our preview window, we will say that we have a do, a catch block, and in the do, we want to let our config equal our model configuration. And we will say that this model configuration is stored in memory only is true. And then we want to create a container, and this will be a try to create a model container, and we will pass in the one with for and configuration. And so the for is our photo do dot self, and the configuration that we have passed in is going to be the config that we just created. And now I want to go ahead and create a sample object just so we can see if this is working. So we will create a photo do, and we will pass in specific data here. So let's go ahead and put all these on their own line by pressing Ctrl+M. And let's say that we have an ID of 0, an album ID of 0, a title of test data, and let's go ahead and grab a URL. So we'll go back to our data here, and let's go ahead and copy this link. So let's give it a URL image here, and again we'll do the same thing for our thumbnail. And now that we've got that set up, we will say that we want our container dot main context to insert our sample object here, and then we want to return our content view, and on our content view we will pass in our model container, and we will pass in our container. There we go. Now, if this doesn't work, we just want to say that there was a fatal error and that we were unable to create the preview. There we go. So as you can see, this is just a image from my YouTube icon, along with our 0 of a test ID here. And in fact, let's go ahead and let's put our HStack inside of VStack, and then we will throw our title down below this. So let's say that we have a text with our item.title, and let's make this text bold just to make it a little easier to read, hopefully. There we go. All right, now this looks good in our preview, so let's go ahead and run this in our simulator. Well, it looks like the images on this site are having some trouble. That might be due to the network that I'm on right now, or it may be that these images are down, because as we can see, it seems to be working fine in our preview window over here with just an image that I own. But as we can see, this is pulling data straight from our database, and we can tell because we are using the photos that we have stored in our database here. Very cool. Now, looks like Swift found that we weren't using our error here, so let's go ahead and get rid of that error code just to fix that warning. And there we go. Now, there are some trade-offs that I do want to go ahead and talk about before we wrap this video. And those trade-offs are, do you actually need SwiftData when you're storing this data from an API? And I would argue in most cases, no, you don't. And here's why. If you've got the data on the API, that is your source of truth. Every time you store this data from your API, you are now creating essentially a duplicate source of truth, or at least a possible source of truth. Even if you're great about being able to handle only ever using the original source of truth of your API, it can still get confusing, especially for new developers, having those multiple sources that could be your source of truth. So I would argue that it would be better to just not store this data, let it come down from the network whenever you initially make the request, and then just store it in memory. Like, don't even worry about storing it in the database at all. Just store it in what essentially amounts to RAM. Never let it get to the DO object, just store it in the DTO object, and let that be what you use throughout your app. Now, the downside to that is, obviously, your app does have a limit as to how much stuff it can have stored in memory like that at one point. The user shouldn't be able to see that much content on a single screen at a time, even if they're on a Mac or an Apple TV, where they've got a really large screen or the ability to show multiple pieces of content at a time. The phones and computers and tablets that we have today are extremely complex and very powerful, and shouldn't ever run out of that kind of memory whenever they're doing simple tasks like displaying a list of data, because one of the nice things about these lists, especially if you use more performant lists like a lazy list, which is what I would typically try to use in this scenario, it will only display the data that's on the screen, plus usually a few cells on either side. So if we've scrolled down the list like we have here, it would show a few cells down here on the bottom that aren't on the screen, and a few cells that would have just gone off the screen, and that's all it would store in memory. And then you could just do a new fetch each time you needed more data. And with that, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And if you leave a comment, just be nice about it. That's all I ask. Thanks. Have a great day.